This week, for my tour of the National Park Service, I'm a little sad, but I think this is a worthwhile turn for our attention. This time, it's the Blue Ridge Parkway. This 469-mile stretch of road through the Blue Ridge section of the Appalachian Range in North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia is closed for the foreseeable future. Planned and partially built as part of the greater Work Projects Administration plans instituted by President Franklin Roosevelt, it helped connect the country in a new way. Up until World War II, most mechanical travel for tourism was done by train. The Blue Ridge Parkway gave people a new and exciting place to go by car. It changed the idea of vacation in America and connected places that were almost inaccessible, not only physically, but mentally. The idea that a middle-class working person might go for a vacation and just go there because it was beautiful was a pretty new idea at the time the parkway was being built, along with the cars that were being built to drive along it. For non-American listeners, the Blue Ridge Parkway was an important element in creating the American version of camping culture. Over the last couple of decades, the National Park Service funds have been slashed. It's been seen as non-essential, as a luxury, as something only the elite enjoy. So why fund it? There's also a push by many Republican politicians to remove the management of these public lands from federal agencies. But the Blue Ridge Parkway could never have been built without a federal view. It's the longest road planned as a single unit in the United States. It crosses into 3 different states, and it was specifically built to create opportunity for people slammed by the Depression in Appalachia and to give America's working class places to go to see beautiful things and do recreation in spaces that weren't operated for pay. This is the people's land, managed and operated for and by regular Americans. It's not fenced off so private entities can profit from it. And in the coming decades, if this extended park and view into one of the most scenic parts of America is going to become accessible to Americans and other visitors, again, we have to remember that the national park system is a precious and unique part of America. If we lose it, we lose more than the land itself. We lose the ability to see places that have brought a sense of awe and wonder to humans for thousands of years, both Americans and those who were here before us. Please don't forget to appreciate and fund our national parks. They are a more important part of who and what America is than we remember sometimes. And if you have memories or photos of the Blue Ridge, I'd love for you to share them with me on Instagram or Threads or Twitter or however you'd like. Episode 130, America Goes on a Diet, Part 1, Grahamism and the Vegetable Diet. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the first big diet trend to hit the American landscape. Early 19th century vegetable cookery hasn't changed much from the last century, but the written works on the food category have. To hear how learned men, in search of a buck and sometimes improved health, were telling you how to eat, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that so far, America seems to have a very joyless and utilitarian relationship with food. Starting from the self-made religious refugees and military adventurers and people looking to make a buck on cod and beef, wheat, pork, and sugar, food in America has always served a purpose. It's fuel to accomplish a goal or a product to make money. The idea that food can be carefully and proudly made to bring joy is not a common or at least popular idea in America up to and even through the early 19th century. And America was not going to start with such foolishness now. Just as America got even the first little bit food secure, it started pumping out pamphlets and books on how you were eating all wrong. While there was already plenty of writing about what to eat if you were actively sick, look at the back of every cookbook published since the 17th century, the idea of choosing a diet to just improve your health, your physical appearance, your body's functioning, and your moral standing, that was a pretty new idea, especially as a semi-commercial venture. Health regimens of the sort were appearing in Western Europe, in places like Prussia, where under the rule of King Frederick William III, many still looked fondly at the standard of manliness set under the rule of Frederick the Great. The compulsory military service instituted also drove people to hunt out a variety of strengthening diets. The dissemination of the scientific method and brand new books of anatomy meant more people, medical persons and regular people, were becoming fascinated with all the organs and chemical reactions happening inside their bodies. And partly due to their exposure to Hindu and various Chinese food cultures, the expanding English middle classes began to explore the idea of a vegetable diet or vegetarianism. And America, never one to be left out of innovation of any sort, also started to enter into the practice of telling people what to eat and how to eat it. Last episode, I spoke about the issue of growing cities and their marked lack of any sort of sewage management. If you look at the large cities of the world at this stage, nearly every one was located next to a river or a lake of some sort. After all, that was the only way to provide for the water needs of a large population. And realistically, part of the water needs of people in this age included the washing away of sewage. The result was that a city's sewage was often mixed into its drinking water source, or it seeped into the groundwater that was being tapped to water the city. Actually directing sewage away from local water sources, or gasp, treating sewage, are very modern new ideas. I mean, Rome is often viewed with awe for its aqueducts. But why do you think they were aqueducting all that water in? Sure, they needed more water, but mainly they had soiled the Tiber to undrinkability in a few different ways. Anyway, one of the consequences of contaminating your drinking water with human and other mammal waste is cholera, and the first recorded cholera outbreaks were in the Indian subcontinent, so it's generally identified as the source of that pathogen, a not unreasonable and generally accepted conclusion. The fact that large numbers of the people in the area also consumed and continue to consume an exclusively vegetarian or vegetable diet struck the English colonists in two different ways. Some English administrators saw this exclusively vegetarian diet as a sign of weakness and degradation, and said things like, "No wonder they live in such squalor." But others noticed that the Brahmin class was exclusively vegetarian, but they held positions of religious and ruling power, and they had a variety of associated dietary rules, and concluded that an all-vegetable diet was a mark of power and purity. While the biblical books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy imply a sort of moral superiority, the Brahmin dietary rules, coupled with their caste standing and powerful societal roles, put this dietary superiority in action. And this interested a certain kind of English person. In ways similar to our own times, the 19th century had a new rapid spreading of information. Ever more new ideas were brought to people's fingertips. Just as now, the 1800s were also a time of wonders and fantastical tales. But the 19th century's source of new things was the ever-growing trade between America and China, and India and England and America. Steamship travel was changing the speed at which people traveled the world, and increased their numbers as well. In the face of this upheaval, America was starting to develop something of a fascination/fear relationship with the rest of the world. Foreigners were determined to be a problem, or at least they brought problems with them. But they also provided fascinating things like tea, jewels, and possible artifacts associated with the Bible. The spreading of the scientific method had given birth to new sciences and changed the way people thought about how the world worked. Archaeology began to develop as a cross between a dilettante's diversion and an emerging science, and studying the past was becoming fashionable. And to Americans, it seemed all the past that really mattered had happened far away in foreign lands. Oh, and geology and fossil hunting were also developing, which brought up even stranger questions about the age of the Earth and the amount of time people had been wandering upon it. This heady cocktail of new information in a time of rapid-paced new developments led to people becoming enamored with the Bible for both comfort and as an historical document with instructions for proper modern living. At the same time, ancient wisdom from biblical lands and from places even further east on topics such as health, medicine, and diet were gaining popularity and credibility. And one of the outgrowths of this mixture was a growing fascination with vegetarian or vegetable diets. In America, the version that took hold most strongly was associated with one Sylvester Graham. Like many people born into America in the 1800s, he came from a large family. He was the youngest of 17 children. And like many youngest children of the time, he had an elderly father who died when he was very young, and a mother who was unable to care for him due to a variety of illnesses and disabilities. This resulted in a fate common to a large number of social reformers of the age. He was shifted around between relatives, suffered from poor sanitation, long hours performing menial labor, frequent hunger, and grew up as a quote-unquote sickly child. These hard experiences would lend him a particular fervor and focus in his future endeavors. Part of Graham's journey included working as a scullion or runner and lowest employee in the kitchen at the tavern of one of his relatives. As a result, his childhood included a large amount of menial labor in the company of men who were drinking heavily. As a result, he developed a violent dislike for any alcoholic drink, and later this would come to include any sort of stimulant, coffee, tea, chocolate, tobacco, and even overly flavorful spices. Those were considered inflaming to a well-ordered constitution. Eventually, he came to the conclusion that enjoying one's food only leads to trouble, or as Graham would have seen it, pumpkin spice, not even once. He became a great believer in the virtues of the country life and fresh air when he was sent to rural upstate New York after having lived in towns and cities most of his life and secured a job as a clerk in a dry goods store. Between moving around and frequent childhood illnesses, he didn't receive much schooling but did read enough and expressed adequate interest in academics to enter Amherst College and develop into a histrionic preacher. And that's not me saying that. This is a descriptor used by contemporary sources, that is, people who heard him preach. Now, Graham didn't complete a degree, and this was common as there were few organized courses of study. But upon leaving Amherst, he began as a Presbyterian preacher, but found just preaching the Bible wasn't enough, and so he ended up being drawn to the influencer life. From his own readings and ruminations, he came to see man as a higher form of the orangutan, and decided that eating the fruits of nature was the optimal way to recapture the health and physical perfection purportedly experienced in the Garden of Eden. Out of this way of thinking, he developed his philosophy of eating and living that would come to be known as Grahamism and develop a following of Grahamites. This first widely shared diet already was hearkening back to an out-of-reach time that was envisioned as a golden age. As the cholera epidemics I spoke about in last episode were appearing around the cities of Europe and America, many people living in these cities, already low on vegetable intake, started shunning them even more. And it was common for doctors to recommend anti-cholera diets. These often consisted of a list of foods, including lean meat, boiled milk, coffee and tea, and home-baked bread. Sometimes it would include things like savory, that is, white potatoes, since they had to be very well cooked before they were edible. But all other fruits and vegetables were to be avoided at all costs. While this seems rather ridiculous or wild, to understand how this worked, we have to put ourselves in the place of an early 19th century city dweller. As we mostly live in places that have electricity, indoor plumbing, and kitchens, it takes a moment to picture how these people tended to live. Only the very wealthy lived in homes with a private kitchen and a separate room for family dining. If you were not wealthy, you likely lived in a single room, and more often than not, that room was shared, either with family members or unrelated roommates. There were no kitchens as such in these rooms. Cooking would have been done over an open flame within a small fireplace, though this contributed to fire danger. Further, food was often not stored, prepared, or consumed in these rooms, as its presence meant visits, or rather more visits, from rats and bugs. And if there was any access to water, it would be from a common tap used to fill boiling kettles or a pitcher that could be poured into a basin for washing. The consumption of most food and drinks took place in public or communal private spaces. A tavern, a counter at a stall where stew is being sold, from a fruit cellar, in a tea room, at an eating house or a boarding house or a hotel dining room. Restaurants with such a thing as menus where one could choose items didn't really exist until well into the 1840s. For most people, going out to eat meant either traveling to another house and eating in another person's dining room, or simply eating the stew, bread, cheese, and pie that was on offer at the local tavern. For most city dwellers who were not wealthy, there was very little choice in food, and there was even less opportunity to prepare food for yourself unless you owned or worked in a place that served food. Certainly toward the edges of cities, there would be larger house lots that would host small farms, gardens, and chicken yards that would supply the city, but people who lived inside cities stayed close to their homes and places of work and largely ate the bread, meat, stew, mush, soups, fish, and drinks others prepared for them. Many a laborer would consume salt pork, cornmeal mush and molasses, or fish stew, brown bread and beer, or peas porridge and gravy, or just bread and drippings, that is, the juice and fat from meat roasted for other purposes, as common meals. They might be laboring for 12 or more hours, making barrels, building ships, driving wagons, carting bricks, cleaning floors, washing clothes. Oh, the laundry, so much laundry, sewing shirts, making deliveries, all manner of city labor away from their home at a job working for another person. This shifted the eating pattern from the rural custom, where a light breakfast was consumed before work, but a large hot meal, dinner, was consumed as a break in the labors of the day at the farmhouse. Especially as factories took the place of workshops, the communal, hot, large midday meal disappeared for these people. Supper, the meal at the end of the day, started to take up the big meal spot. And in all of the city living, an imagined glory days of a more rural, idealized America and its colonial days started to glow from the past. Graham, as he honed his message to men yearning for this lost golden age, came up with a few dieting precepts that America took up from the start and has never really put down. The first one was that Graham's vegetable diet, its secret lies in its links to an imaginary past and phenomena in faraway lands poorly understood by the purveyor of the diet. Graham, the writers who both influenced him and followed him, brought up the Brahmin Hindu, spelled with 2 O's as it so often was in 19th century writing, and made much of their spiritual strength and the way they led their society. Second, there were wonders the diet would perform on the body. In this case, if one were to correctly follow the diet exactly, one could expect the following benefits. The body would not be subject to noticing the cold, except for in the most extreme weathers. No heavy clothing would be necessary. Further, correct application of the diet would render those successful followers unbothered by heat. Consuming the vegetable diet in the correct manner with the perfect combination of foods, spaced out at all-important 6-hour intervals, would leave the dieter stronger, with more energy, and of course impervious to these swings in temperature. Third, just like many of the current refresh, restart, or quick startup diets today, the vegetable diet, evangelized by Graham and his Grahamites, included a sample menu for a week. Unlike some modern diets which have very exacting descriptions of what to eat, the vegetable diet included quite a bit of vagueness. For example, Monday would be pea soup, vegetables, fruit, and plum pudding. Tuesday, baked peas, vegetables, fruit, and apple custard. Wednesday would be vegetable soup, rice, and prune pie, and so on. It's worth noting that there are no recipes or even preparation suggestions for the recommended food. And other than vegetables or fruit, there's no more specificity than that. Now, part of the lack of recipes comes from the fact that there were a limited number of ways people were doing things like making pea soup. But a larger part of the lack of recipes is that Graham had no particular knowledge about preparing food, other than specifically eschewing the use of spices, even viewing salt and pepper with suspicion. A fourth item, surprisingly evergreen, is that the preparing of food, and thus the health of families, husbands and children, was the responsibility of wives and mothers. While food preparation in English and American culture has always largely rested with women, except in the most professional of roles, here it gets a boost. This vegetable diet is directed at men to help them obtain better health and greater manliness. But the preparation and presentation of the food falls entirely on women. In fact, Graham made much of the fact that his own success with the diet lay with all of the knowledge and preparation that came from his wife, who meticulously prepared and served all of his meals. The fifth part puts an even more modern and familiar twist on the diet program outlined in Graham's vegetable diet. He begins to paint a fantastical picture of the past as it rotates around a large number of imaginary circumstances. For example, the strength and success of the Romans was granted by their diet of roughly ground grains that they turned into a rustic bread, but then they lost it all as they switched to eating more refined bread, and were subsequently defeated by the Huns, who gained their strength from their rustic whole grain bread. Graham carries this fable forward, pointing out that now that Americans are milling their flour finer in their new mechanical mills and sifters, they are losing the vigor once lent to them by a diet supported by a rustic bread of a bygone age. He waxes purple in his prose as he conjures visions of a mythical mother grinding grain to make the daily bread, full of the bran and roughage required to grow a hardy race. Of course, few people had wheat bread in the American age Graham is speaking of, and further, he never had his mother making him bread during the golden hour. Remember, he was shipped off to relatives, and the fact that he speaks of daily bread baking shows just how removed he is from understanding how food was made. From the fabulism of this rose gold past, Graham sets up a sixth peculiar feature of American diet culture. You need more money than you probably have to do this diet correctly. In order to make bread correctly, according to the Graham method, first, one must store the grain correctly, and he lists off just about every item common to a 19th century house, none of which should be stored in the same room as the grain. So first of all, you have to build a separate grain room. Check. Next, instead of getting one's flour ground for a year or half a year all in one go, which was common for people who grew grain or simply bought flour, Graham exhorted one to make the trip to the miller a weekly event, or ideally, to just grind enough grain for each batch of daily bread. This was an expense in time and money not accessible to anyone except possibly people operating a mill. And those flours needed to be ground to a particular special roughness. The common fine flour most people were grinding at their local wind and water mills was too refined for health. And the bread it produced, that's what Graham was calling disgusting trash. The way one didn't have to chew one's bread so much was clearly weakening the modern man. Anyway, once you had ground your flour to the correct roughness, it also could not be stored with many other items commonly found in a 19th century kitchen. So one needed to build a special cabinet for storing the ground flour. Another cost, another accessory. This onerous list of requirements for correct flour to make the correct bread led many of the followers to end up grinding their own flour in a variety of devices, including hand-cranked coffee mills. But the admonitions regarding the correct manufacture of bread didn't end there. The correct yeast had to be obtained. Using yeast from a brewer, the barm, that was deemed unacceptable, as this was yeast that had been in contact with alcohol and other infamous materials. The woman who was already specially grinding grain now also had to grow her own yeast, even when local yeast was available. Sure, plenty of women made and saved their own yeast, but saying that they could never use more easily available yeast smacks of modern diet admonitions. Yeah, sure, you can use ingredient X, but only the one that is far more work and probably more expensive. Okay, so once the grain was properly stored, ground in incremental batches to the correct hardiness, mixed with the correct yeast, and baked, you might think, surely this loaf, though grainy and dense and requiring manful extra mastication, is ready for consumption. And here you'd be wrong. If you've ever smelled freshly baked bread and that slightly sweet yeasty smell, part of what you are smelling are some lovely esters and some alcohols that were the work of the little yeasties that gave up their single cells to the endeavor. And because both alcohol and instinctive or thoughtless enjoyment were anathema to Graham, this bread must sit for a full 24 hours before being consumed to ensure that the alcohol had dissipated. Further, it was important that the bread be consumed in a thoughtful manner. Only considered enjoyment was compatible with a well-regulated constitution. Overmuch anticipation and enjoyment of food, or food that was inherently exciting and attractive to the eater, created chaos and depended on the grosser instincts of the human, more animal-like and too unrefined. The Graham diet also tapped into the exclusivity granted by self-imposed denial to the point of suffering. An associate of Graham, William A. Alcott, yes, a cousin of sorts of Louisa May, collected testimonials from medical and other learned men speaking of their relationship with the diet. While each and every one of them claimed that following the Graham or vegetable diet increased their energy, their ability to stand cold, heat, and discomfort, to resist temptation, and of course, their internal digestive activity was operating in ways that was the envy of other humans. See, the concern with and bragging about the mastery of regular intestinal health was already at the forefront. But there's an interesting side to many of these testimonials, and this is where this first diet is clearly less modern. The letter writers seem to be in earnest, because they also speak of the suffering and discomfort they endured or continued to endure in their strict adherence to Grahamism. Since this is the first big diet trend with testimonials and a marketing campaign, there was not yet the practice of cutting out all the negatives and talking up all the changes you won't have to make. Most of the letter writers began by speaking of how much better they felt and how they regained their vigor while on the diet. But then they would continue on to say how they had to stop the diet for a bit because it was wearing on them. They had to go back to eating meat and some of the other forbidden items because all of this being vigorous was wearing them down. And some of them spoke of how, yes, they knew that this bland diet was truly better for them and made them more sensitive and all sorts of other things, and they felt so very incredibly good while on it, but the cravings for the food they had given up were interfering too much with their lives, so they had added back in a bit of meat or tea and coffee on occasion. And there was even one letter writer who, in their efforts to adhere to the diet, found himself so miserable he had to isolate himself from sight or smell of the things he craved. Because his combined efforts and misery made him so unpleasant to those around him, he chose to isolate himself and live alone so he might follow the diet more exactly. And there are many of the letter writers who speak of how they made themselves less comfortable and cut themselves off for multiple sources of enjoyment, but they proudly spoke of how successfully they were following the diet. Seeing this trend of inflicting a certain amount of suffering and isolation in order to attain a sort of purity to satisfy these diet rules someone had just made up with a vague understanding of complex foreign or historical concepts starts with this diet, and it will continue to color American diet culture going forward. A few quotes from the writings surrounding Grahamism illustrate this strange surety. There is one John Smith of Malton, England, and in his treatise on the benefits of fruits and farinacea, The Proper Food of Man, from 1837, Mr. Smith had the following to say: "It is not uncommon in this city for persons, especially invalids, to assert that they have tried the diet for 1, 3, 6, or even 12 months, and found it to decidedly disagree with them. Hence, they have come to the conclusion that however advantageous it might be to some constitutions, it did not agree with theirs. I have taken some pains to investigate the circumstances of many of these failures and have invariably found that the whole cause of the difficulty was a morbid appetite which the experimenter would not or did not control, or an injudicious quantity and preparation of vegetable foods. I have never known a failure, either with well persons or invalids, where the vegetable diet was regulated by correct physiological principles. So let me unwind some of the 19th century flowery flourishes here. First, Farinacea is a fancy way of saying grains, wheat, corn, barley, and so on. But Farinacea sounds much more scientific. Second, most of what is being said here is that if the diet didn't work for you, even after a year, the diet wasn't the problem. The person trying the diet was. They were just doing it wrong. A morbid appetite implies that the practitioner was eating portions that were too large, and they would not or could not control it. Or that they were using the wrong fruits and vegetables, or they were preparing them wrong, which is fun since almost no direction in any writings for exactly what to eat, how much of it to eat, or how to prepare it is given. And John Smith wraps things up by saying invariably, that is, without variation, as long as the correct physiological principles were followed, the diet will work. And guess how one might learn the correct practice of the correct physiological principles? By joining the Graham Society, by attending classes, by going to recommended health spas, by buying the right pamphlets. That's right, just as with modern diet commercials that promise amazing results but require you to buy in to learn this one weird trick, Graham and his followers started creating this culture as well. The Grahamite enterprise would even end up by selling Graham bread, the precursor to Graham crackers. Now, this was not made by the mythical mother hand-grinding properly rough flour from gently stored wheat, but rather it was a mechanically made product. But it adhered to the rules Graham and his society had determined, and you could buy it at a location near you. Now, I realize I am going pretty hard at Graham here, and it is important to understand the ways American diet culture started out with so many of the elements it still contains, but has supercharged. But I would be remiss if I didn't also discuss what made Grahamism so appealing to so many people. What made the diet and the cultural movement so attractive to people that they would follow it, even to their own personal misery? First of all, he was right about many of the things he was upset about. Working as a child servant or any sort of servant or laborer in early 19th century cities was hard on people. Living where the effluvia of humans, animals, and industry lay in the streets, and heavy rain brought rivers of horse dung up to the door was unhealthy. The unvarying diet that lacked important nutrients and adequate vegetable matter was a problem. Moving out to that fresh air of rural areas and eating a more varied diet in prosperous rural areas like upstate New York, which provided much of the milk and wheat to New York City and other metropolitan areas of the state, was a better place to live. And since people getting wealthy off the misery of the new city worker, as well as the government, were doing little or nothing to improve cities, Graham's injunction to move made sense to people. Further, the Grahamite Society built things called Graham houses as reasonably priced hostels in many cities for travelers to stay in. As they forbid alcohol on their premises and were not part of a bar or tavern as many inns were, they proved to be a good place for women and families to stay. People who were not wealthy did have to travel sometimes, and finding a place to stay that did not put the traveler in danger of assault, sexual or simple, could be a challenge at a reasonable price. Thus, these temperance hostelries served an important purpose. The first few decades of the 19th century is where the temperance or prohibition movements do start in America. Our particularly black and white relationship with alcohol made the young country a fertile field for this movement as well, which will be covered many more times in this series. But Graham not only appealed to people, women especially, looking for alternative beverages to distilled spirits. He was also among those ringing the bell about how the woman's place is in the home, bearing children and caring for the family. That's right, already in the first few decades of the 1800s, as far as some people were concerned, there were already too many women not fulfilling this role, and it was breaking society. I mean, sure, there were plenty of people who had no interest in giving up their roast pork or rib of beef, but were happy to support Graham in his admonition that all the work of keeping the house and preparing the food should stay with a woman who stayed inside the house. Any aid she reached for, whether the bread of a baker or yeast from a brewer or any of these newfangled exciting spices, were to be discouraged as signs of her laziness or lack of personal purity and strength. Further, regardless of her talents, desires, or interests, there was only one proper occupation, and that was as mother to a household. Working for pay was evidence of a broken society or moral failure on her part. The fact that the only thing a proper woman should be doing to fix the situation, however, was to housewife harder, even back then. It's an interesting view. Any sort of admonition to those in power politically or to men generally that there are some things that could be done, like clean up the water, maybe some regulations regarding clean and safe housing and workplaces, possibly labor laws limiting the exploitation of children and workers generally, maybe regulating food production and the selling of alcohol. These were never approached. Instead, it was the proper preparation of the proper foods and their proper consumption in the proper amounts on the proper schedule that would fix things. Graham spread the idea that the self-regulation that would come from the application of the vegetable diet, that would fix all of society's ills. All through his life, while he supported temperance, he personally didn't see the need to advocate for anything other than abstinence from a variety of enjoyable things and vegetarianism to improve people's lives. After all, if you could alleviate your own personal woes and the loss of manliness of that past golden age, it's probably close enough to the same thing. Now, over the following seasons, I will continue to call out diets that had cultural force in the upcoming eras. But the fact that this first one had so many hallmarks of modern American diet culture almost 200 years earlier really surprised me. The joyless and utilitarian view of food is there. The admonishment that enjoying food is animalistic is there. There are the warnings about imbuing food with excess flavors. There's the creation of categories of food as good and bad, along with the implication that success with a diet is the dieter's entire responsibility, instead of recognizing that there are many good ways to eat and not all of them work for everyone. Right from the start, if it doesn't work, it's your fault. And there's the long-standing implication that even when a diet isn't directed at women, somehow it's still their responsibility. That was a doozy. Now, all of this, while depressing, it's also enlightening. American diet culture is carrying around more baggage than I had ever thought it was. Including it in America's particular relationship with food, it's important. I like to believe that knowing this can probably only help, at least in the long run. But enough of not eating. In the early 19th century, there are plenty of people who are enjoying food, even if only fleetingly. And one of the things that starts to emerge are a few uniquely American flavors. Next episode, it's time to take a look at the American fruits the country starts to recognize and appreciate. Among other things, we'll look at persimmons, pawpaws, and American grapes. So get ready to spit out some seeds. And thanks for listening. Any email, questions, or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com, along with any of my social media presences at THOAFood. Downloading the episode helps me know you're out there, but even better than that are your reviews. Let people know you're listening and enjoying the show, or at least you're finding it interesting. Want more food and history in your future? Well, there's Women's Work, the untold story of America's female farmer. It's had its PBS broadcast debut in the Spokane, Washington area, and will be showing up in more regions, including Western Washington, sometime in November. So stay tuned for more details when we go national. Hoping it's soon. I'm also doing a deep dive into the 19th century with co-host Jamie Lewis of Plague of Strength in our much looser and rather wilder podcast, Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters. It's still food, but now with fashion, fighting, fraud, and a few other Fs, which means that one F is for fun, as opposed to this podcast, which strives to be E for everyone. Right now, we're romping our way through a retelling of Zorro in high telenovela style, so saddle up. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads, Insta, and elsewhere as @THOA Food, and all this information is available in the show description.